No one invited me to that wedding. But the second Eleanor Whitmore saw me sitting among the guests, she stopped walking, looked at her groom, and said one word that destroyed 2 families, ended a decade-long scheme, and turned the most anticipated wedding in Dunhill Valley into the biggest scandal the town had seen in 50 years. That word was no. And I need you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this story. I am not a good man. I don't mean that the way men say it, when they want you to think they're interesting. I mean it the way the people of Dunhill Valley meant it. The mothers who lowered their voices when they said my name in front of their daughters. The businessmen who shook my hand only when they needed money. The whispers that followed me through every room I entered in this valley. Damien Ashford, the widower from Ravencrest, cold as the cliffs his house sits on, dangerous in ways no one can quite prove. Women like Eleanor Whitmore were warned about men like me from childhood. And yet, when her whole world collapsed on a wet Saturday morning in October, when the church doors opened and the rain hit her face, and 300 people inside that building began to tear her name apart, she got into my car. She didn't hesitate. She didn't even look back. And that, more than anything else that happened that day, is what you need to understand first. This is the story of how I ended up in that church, what I knew that no one else in that building knew, and what happened to us both in the weeks that followed, in an estate on the edge of a cliff, surrounded by fog and secrets, and a town that had already decided we were both beyond saving. Let's go back to the beginning. Eleanor Whitmore was supposed to be the perfect bride. In Dunhill Valley, that meant something specific. It meant she was the eldest daughter of the Whitmore family. 4 generations of wine, land, and old money that had weathered wars and recessions and the particular brutality of the Scottish climate. It meant she was 28, educated, composed, the kind of beautiful that photographs well at society events. It meant she had accepted a proposal from Nathaniel Blackwood, heir to one of the oldest properties in the region, and that everyone in the valley had exhaled collectively, the way they do when something they've been hoping for finally happens. The wedding at St. Callum's Church was sold out 6 weeks before it happened. That's the only way to describe it. 300 invitations, a waiting list for the charity viewing outside the church, a journalist from the Highland Register positioned on the steps since 8 in the morning. The florist had been booked for 14 months. The dress had been altered 3 times. The Whitmore family had spent money they did not have on a reception that was meant to signal to the entire valley that everything was fine. Everything wasn't fine. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The ceremony was scheduled for 11 o'clock. I arrived at 10:45, walked through the side entrance, and sat in the 3rd row from the back on the left side, in the shadow of a stone pillar where I could see the altar and the doors and every face in that building without being immediately visible from the front. I want to be clear. I had not told Eleanor I was coming. I had told her, 6 weeks earlier, that if she ever needed to be certain, if she ever reached the moment and needed to know that everything we'd uncovered was real and solid and enough to act on, she should look for me. That if I was in the room, it meant the answer was yes. Everything is true. You have what you need. I hadn't been certain until the morning of the wedding that I would actually go. Then I got in the car. I told myself I was there for justice, that this was about Nathaniel Blackwood, and the pattern I had spent 4 years watching him repeat, that Eleanor Whitmore was simply the latest target of a man I should have stopped long before he reached this valley. I told myself a lot of things that morning. At 11 minutes past 10, the great oak doors at the far end of St. Callum's opened, and Eleanor Whitmore appeared on her father's arm. I had seen her exactly 4 times before that morning. I knew her face well enough, but I was not prepared. And I say this as a man who prides himself on being prepared. I was not prepared for the way she moved, not like a bride, not like a woman being delivered to an altar. She moved like someone walking toward a decision they have already made, carrying it in their body before they have said it out loud. There was a stillness about her that the ivory dress and the pearls and the carefully arranged hair couldn't disguise. She was not nervous. She was ready. She came down the aisle, and the congregation exhaled around her. 300 people releasing the breath of approval. Nathaniel Blackwood stood at the altar looking exactly the way he always looked. Handsome, controlled, impeccably positioned. He smiled at her. The organ swelled. And then Eleanor's eyes moved across the crowd. Not searching, scanning. The final check of a person about to do something irreversible. Her gaze swept the pews, and then, without warning, found me in the shadow of my pillar. 3 seconds. That's all it took. I held her gaze, and I let her read my face, which said the only thing that mattered. I'm here. It's all true. You know what to do. She stopped walking. Her father's hand tightened on her arm. From 2 pews back, her mother made a sound like a sharp intake of breath that carried above the organ. At the altar, Nathaniel took 1 step forward. Not toward her, exactly, but the step of a man beginning to understand that something is wrong. "Eleanor?" her father said. She looked at Nathaniel, and I watched her do what I think she had been working up to for months. She looked at him without the filter of obligation, or fear, or the slow social pressure that had been applied to her since the moment this arrangement began. She looked at him clearly, the way you look at something when you finally stop pretending it's what someone told you it was. He reached for her hand. "Eleanor." No. Quiet. Steady. Unhesitating. The organ died on a half chord. The silence that fell over St. Dean Callum's church in the next 4 seconds was the loudest thing I have ever heard in my life. Then Eleanor Whitmore turned around. She walked back down the aisle, not running, not fleeing, walking with a purpose she hadn't been allowed to exercise in 2 years. She passed the Blackwood family pew. She passed the Chamber of Commerce. She passed her cousins with their mouths open. She passed the journalist's camera crew who had no business being inside but had gotten in anyway. She passed me. I stood up and followed her. The oak doors opened. The rain hit. Behind us, 300 people began to make the sound of a town that has just lost its favorite story and is already inventing a new one. My car was on the lane behind the church. She found it without me telling her. Got into the passenger seat. I got behind the wheel. "Where do you want to go?" I asked. She looked at the stone wall in front of us. From behind it, even through the walls, the noise of the congregation was audible. Urgent. Rising. The particular pitch of a crowd processing a social earthquake. "Anywhere," she said. "That isn't here." I drove. And I need to tell you something honestly, because this story doesn't work unless I'm honest. In that car, driving away from the wreckage of a wedding I had helped deconstruct, I felt something I had been very careful not to feel for 4 years. I felt like something was starting. I pushed it away. Filed it under later, under complicated, under the long list of things that were not relevant to the immediate situation. It came back anyway. It always came back. To understand why I walked into that church uninvited, you need to understand what I knew about Nathaniel Blackwood that no one in Dunhill Valley knew. And to understand that, you need to go back 4 years. Before the Valley, before Ravencrest, before I became the cautionary tale that mothers told their daughters at charity dinners. My wife's name was Vivian. She was ill for the last 3 years of her life. A degenerative condition, slow and then fast, the way those things go. We spent those years making decisions that no one should have to make, together, while also trying to maintain the appearance of a normal life, because Vivian insisted on it. She did not want to be someone's tragedy. She wanted to be herself for as long as possible. I tried to give her that. Nathaniel Blackwood was representing a third party in a property dispute during Vivian's second year of illness. The details of the dispute are not important. What is important is this: he had somehow obtained information about Vivian's medical history. Private, detailed, damning in the way only private information can be. And he used it as leverage, without warning, without negotiation, with the casual efficiency of a man for whom other people's pain is simply a resource. I dealt with the dispute. I protected Vivian from knowing exactly how it had been resolved. 3 months later, she told me she'd always known he was the kind of man you could tell on sight. She was right. She was always right about people. She died 14 months after that. I came to Dunhill Valley 2 years later because Ravencrest Estate needed an owner, and I needed somewhere with no associations. I was not looking for anything or anyone. I was not looking, I told myself, at all. Then his name started appearing in the local paper. Nathaniel Blackwood, new arrival to the valley, engaged to the Whitmore girl. I recognized his methods before I recognized his name, because Nathaniel had done this before, not once, but twice. 2 Scottish estates acquired through engineered marriages following strategic financial pressure. 1 family left with nothing, 1 still in litigation 7 years later. I started looking into the Whitmore estate's finances. What I found was exactly what I expected, and worse than I hoped. Thomas Whitmore had been quietly drowning for 3 years. The vineyards that had survived 4 generations were mortgaged twice over. The debt servicing was consuming the harvest income before it could be reinvested. He had hidden it from his wife. He had hidden it from his daughter. He was managing it the way men of his background manage unbearable things, by not speaking of it and hoping it would become manageable before someone noticed. And Nathaniel had noticed. He had researched the Whitmore estate's financial position before he ever attended the charity dinner where he met Eleanor. He had chosen her the way a surgeon chooses an incision point, precisely after study, at the exact place that would be most effective. The prenuptial framework, which Eleanor had not yet been shown, because her parents intended to present it 2 weeks before the wedding as a fait accompli, would have transferred management of Whitmore Vineyard Holdings to a jointly held company, 5 directors, 3 of them Blackwood family appointees. Eleanor's name was not on the board. Her father's name was not on the board. Within 18 months of the wedding, the Whitmore family would have owned the land in name only. Within 3 years, they would have owned nothing at all. I sat with this information for 2 months, turning it over, arguing with myself about whether it was my business, whether my history with Nathaniel compromised my judgment, whether I had the right to insert myself into something that hadn't been offered to me. Then I went to a charity auction in the village hall, and every other seat was taken, and I sat down next to Eleanor Whitmore. She was not what I had built in my mind. I had a version of her assembled from a distance, the composed, decorative daughter of an old family, gracious, dutiful, perfectly positioned, the kind of woman who had learned to be an asset before she'd had the chance to discover what else she might be. Wrong. The wine case from the Whitmore estate came up at auction, and I said something about the 2019 vintage. Specific, technical, the kind of comment that only lands if the other person knows what you're talking about. She turned and looked at me with the expression of someone hearing their own language spoken by a stranger. "How do you know anything about our harvest?" she said. Not suspicious, alert. I told her I'd been watching what was happening to the Whitmore estate, that I thought she should be watching too. She didn't flinch, didn't perform offense at the intrusion, just looked at me with those direct, evaluating eyes, the look I came to know over the following weeks as her real face, the one that didn't perform anything for anyone. "Who are you?" she said. I told her. I watched the slight recalibration, the name landing, the town's version of me brushing past her, and then she set it aside the way she set aside everything that wasn't immediately useful. "All right," she said. "What do you know?" We met 4 more times over the following weeks, each meeting at the auction house, each with a professional pretext, each one longer than the last. I showed her everything: the documents, the pattern, the 2 previous estates, the prenuptial framework her own parents had agreed to without telling her. I watched her read it all. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She went very still, the way still water goes still, not frozen, but deep. And then she started asking questions, precise, surgical questions that cut to exactly the part of the evidence I hadn't yet explained. Questions that told me she had already understood what I'd given her and was now working out what it meant for everything that came next. At the end of the 4th meeting, she looked at me across the table and said, "Why are you helping me?" I told her the truth, the partial truth, about Vivian, about the property dispute, about recognizing Nathaniel's methods and choosing, this time, not to walk away. I did not tell her the other thing I had been noticing across 4 meetings, that I had been finding reasons to extend each conversation by 20 minutes, that I had driven home from the auction house 3 times, thinking about something she'd said rather than about the problem I was ostensibly there to solve. "If I stop the wedding," she said, "my family loses everything anyway." "Not necessarily," I said, and I told her about the 2019 vintage, the investors I knew, the path that didn't require her to sign herself over to a man who intended to use her as a legal mechanism. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "How will I know when it's time?" I looked at her. "I'll be there," I said. "If I'm in the room, it means everything is real. You'll have what you need." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the nod of a woman who has just made a decision, and said she'd better get back to the charity committee before her absence was noted. I watched her walk out of the auction house, and I sat there for considerably longer than I should have, and thought about what I had just set in motion and what it was going to cost. I told myself it was justice. By then, I almost believed it. In Dunhill Valley, the gossip moved faster than the weather. By Sunday evening, less than 36 hours after Eleanor walked out of St. Callum's, the story had been told, retold, embellished, and weaponized by every social network the Valley possessed. I know this because Ravencrest is not as isolated as I prefer it to appear, and because 3 different people sent me versions of what was being said, presumably as a warning. The kindest version, Eleanor Whitmore had suffered a breakdown at the altar, was recovering somewhere, and the wedding would be rescheduled. The most popular version, Eleanor had been conducting a secret affair with the most disreputable man in Dunhill Valley, had humiliated Nathaniel Blackwood in front of his entire family, and had fled the church in her wedding dress to live in a house on a cliff with a man whose wife had died under suspicious circumstances. That version, I will tell you honestly, was not entirely inaccurate. Eleanor did not have her phone. She had left it in the vestry, and neither of us made any particular effort to retrieve it. She was not ready for the volume of information it would deliver, and she knew it. What she was ready for, what surprised me, and I am not easily surprised, was work. By the 3rd night, she had stopped crying. I know this because I could hear her from the library on the 2nd night, and then couldn't on the 3rd. I did not go to her. She was not a woman who needed company while she processed things. She needed space and silence, and, I learned quickly, access to books. By the 5th day, she was at the kitchen table before I came down in the morning, with a notebook open and 3 of my land management texts stacked beside her coffee. By the 7th day, she had mapped out a preliminary financial rehabilitation plan for the Whitmore estate on 4 pages of notes, with 3 questions for me that she had been unable to answer herself and had written down to ask later, rather than interrupting whatever she assumed I was doing. By the 10th day, I understood something I had been avoiding understanding since the charity auction. I no longer wanted her to leave. That was when it became dangerous. Not in the way the town thought it was dangerous. Not the salacious version that was circulating through every drawing room in the valley. Dangerous in the quieter, more permanent way. The kind of feeling that doesn't announce itself loudly but simply settles in, weight by weight, until you go to move and realize it's been there for a while. I didn't tell her. I had very sound reasons for not telling her, which I rehearsed regularly. She was rebuilding her entire life. She was living in my house because of a crisis I had partly engineered. She had just escaped one man making decisions about her future. The last thing she needed was another one deciding, without consultation, that he had feelings about her. I kept the reasons at the front of my mind and let her keep using my library. On a Tuesday afternoon in the 4th week, I saw Nathaniel's car from the study window. I want to describe this moment carefully because it tells you something about who I was and who Eleanor was becoming. My first instinct was to go down to meet him before he reached the house, to manage the confrontation, keep it away from her, resolve it on my terms. That is what I have always done. I am better at managing things from a distance than at letting other people be in rooms where things happen. I went down. He was standing at the bottom of the drive in a suit that cost more than most people in this valley made in a month, and he was furious. Not the controlled, pressurized fury of the boardroom, the raw, graceless anger of a man who has been denied something he had already mentally possessed. He told me I had interfered in a private arrangement. He told me Eleanor was confused and that I had manipulated her state of mind. He said things about my past, about Vivian, about the rumors that followed me through this valley, about what kind of man takes in a vulnerable woman in a crisis and calls it charity. He was trying to make me angry enough to say something he could use. I waited until he was finished. Then I said, "She isn't available. If she wants to speak with you, she'll contact your solicitors." He said he'd be back. I said, "That's your choice. I'll be here." He got in his car. I went back inside. Eleanor was in the hallway. She had heard enough to understand the shape of it. She didn't ask for details. She looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't fully read, something between relief and something more complicated, and said, "Thank you." "Don't," I said. "I'm going to," she said. "You can be uncomfortable about it." I went back to the study. I sat at the desk for longer than was productive. Clarissa Vane arrived at the end of the 5th week. I need you to understand who Clarissa Vane was, because she matters. She had been Vivian's closest friend for 20 years before Vivian got sick. She had been present for most of the difficult decisions. She had her own interpretation of how those decisions had gone, an interpretation in which I was the villain of the story, in which my choices in Vivian's final months had been self-interested rather than guided by what Vivian herself had asked for. She had been building that narrative for 4 years. She was also, I had recently discovered, connected to Nathaniel Blackwood through the Edinburgh legal network. Not closely, but enough. I came in from the garden to find her in my entrance hall, doing what she did best, positioning herself as the reasonable person in the room while delivering maximum damage through the most gracious possible channel. She was speaking to Eleanor, and Eleanor was listening. Not with the open, evaluating attention she used when she was genuinely interested in what someone was saying, but with the polite, contained expression of a woman who is being very careful not to react until she knows exactly what is happening. I heard enough. Clarissa was telling her that Damien Ashford was a man with a pattern, that generous impulses toward women in distress were a known characteristic, that Eleanor might want to consider whether what she was reading as protection was something else entirely, whether she might be developing expectations that the situation didn't support. I walked into the hall. "Clarissa," I said, "I wasn't expecting you." What followed was a conversation I will not fully reproduce here. The relevant points. I told her that my arrangement with Eleanor was not her business. I told her that her concerns about my character were noted, and as always, unwelcome. I told her the door was behind her. She left with the poise of someone who believes they have planted exactly the seeds they intended to plant. She wasn't wrong. At dinner that evening, Eleanor was quieter than usual. The air between us had changed. Not cold, but cautious. I felt it the way you feel a weather system moving in before it arrives. Then she said, "What did she mean about a pattern?" I told her. I told her about Vivian's illness, about the decisions, about what Clarissa believed and what the truth actually was. I told her without self-justification and without asking for sympathy, because Eleanor didn't respond well to either of those things, and because the plain version was the only version that felt right. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "She's connected to Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." "He sent her." "Almost certainly." She looked at the table between us. Then she looked at me. "It's not going to work," she said. "Whatever she was trying to do, it's not going to work." I looked at her. "I know," I said. And I meant more by that than the 2 words could hold, but she heard it anyway. I was becoming convinced that Eleanor heard most things that existed in the space between what I said and what I meant. It was one of the more unsettling discoveries I had made about her, one of the more remarkable ones. By the 6th week, Dunhill Valley had settled on its preferred version of events. Eleanor Whitmore was not a woman who had escaped a predatory arrangement. She was not a daughter who had discovered her family was being used as collateral. She was not, in the Valley's collective opinion, a person who had made a courageous and rational decision with significant information behind it. She was the girl who had lost her mind at the altar and was now living in sin on a cliff with the most questionable widower in the region. That story was cleaner. It required no complicated understanding of financial fraud or real estate acquisition strategies. It had a clear villain, Eleanor, for humiliating a good man, and a clear moral. This is what happens when women make impulsive decisions. The Valley was very comfortable with that story. What the Valley did not see was what I saw. Saw every morning when she came down early, and read until the light was strong enough to work by. Saw in the questions she asked, precise, informed, always one step ahead of where she should have been given only a few weeks of intensive study into a world she'd been excluded from. Saw in the way she sat with her father on the phone, patient and clear, and without the performance of warmth she'd spent years deploying in place of the real thing. She was becoming herself in my library, at my kitchen table, on the bench by the river. It was the most remarkable thing I had watched happen to a person in years, possibly ever. She asked me once, toward the end of the 6th week, sitting on the bench with the autumn light going bronze across the river, why I had come to Dunhill Valley. Not about the estate, about me, the personal version. No one in the Valley had asked me that. Not directly, not with the expectation of a real answer. I told her about the months after Vivian, the silence of a house that still held the shape of a person who was no longer in it. The particular exhaustion of grief that isn't dramatic, not the acute, breaking kind, but the long, low, heavy kind that sits in your chest like ballast. She listened without filling the silence. "I'm sorry about Vivian," she said when I was done. "I know," I said. "I mean it. Not the polite version, the real version." I looked at the river. "I know that too," I said. She nodded once. Then she went back to her notebook. That evening, she told me she had looked up the Bordeaux viticulture program, that it was still running, that she had been thinking, for the first time in years, about who she had been trying to become before everything got arranged around her. "Apply," I said. "I might," she said. "I want to get the estate stable first." "You can do both." She looked at me sideways. "You're very certain about what I can do." I've been watching you for 6 weeks, I said. I'm certain. She didn't answer. But something shifted in the quality of her expression, something that was not quite the evaluating look and not quite the smile, but somewhere between the two. I looked back at the river and did not say anything else. I had a great deal more to not say. The meeting with Thomas Whitmore happened on a Thursday in November. I had prepared it carefully. The documents, the investor introductions, the rehabilitation framework for the estate. But more than the content, I had prepared the timing. Thomas Whitmore was a man whose pride and whose shame had become indistinguishable from each other after 3 years of managing a secret. He needed to be approached at the right moment, in the right company, by the right person. I let Eleanor lead it. That was not my original plan. My original plan was to present the financial picture clearly and let Thomas respond. But in the car on the way to the estate, she asked me a question so precise about one of the investment terms that I handed her the relevant documents and said, "You explain that part." She looked at me. "You know it better than I do," I said, which was true. She took the documents. In her father's office. That dusty, pipe-scented room where 3 months earlier she had found a folder that changed everything. Eleanor Whitmore laid out the truth of her family's situation with more clarity and less cruelty than anyone had a right to manage on their own family. Thomas listened, then he looked at his daughter and said, "I should have told you." "Yes," she said. "You should have." It wasn't forgiveness. It was not the performance of forgiveness. It was something harder and more honest than that. The acknowledgement of a wrong, made without deflection, received without ceremony. Thomas looked at the documents. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you need from me." We drove back up the cliff road in the dark. The valley was below us, its light small and scattered through the mist. She said thank you. I told her not to. She said she was going to anyway, and I could be uncomfortable about it. I said, "All right." Then she said, "What happens now? With Nathaniel?" I told her what I believed, that his position depended on the marriage, and that without it, his legal leverage was significantly reduced, that his solicitors would make one more attempt, and when it failed, he would look for his next opportunity elsewhere. "Unless someone stops him," she said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to be the one who does that," she said. "Not now, but eventually. I want to expose the pattern, make it public, make it impossible for him to do this to another family." I looked at the road. "I have 4 years of documentation," I said. "I know," she said. "I was hoping you'd offer." I drove in silence for a while. Then I said, "The award ceremony for regional wines is in the spring. The Whitmore 2019 vintage is a strong candidate, and Nathaniel Blackwood will almost certainly attend." She turned to look at me. "He'll be there," I said, "because men like him attend every public event where they can perform respectability. He won't expect me to be there," she said. "No. Or to be prepared. No." She turned back to the road. I could see, in my peripheral vision, the expression on her face that I had learned to read over 6 weeks. Not the composed version, not the evaluating version, but the third one. The one that meant she was deciding something. "I'll need everything you have," she said. "You'll have it," I said. She went to Bordeaux in September. I drove her to the airport myself. We loaded her luggage and stood on the departure level in the particular awkwardness of 2 people who have been sharing a kitchen for 8 weeks and are now standing 3 feet apart in a public place, with something unspoken between them that neither has yet had the courage to address directly. She looked at me. "I'm coming back," she said. "I know," I said. "I mean to the valley, to the estate." A pause, a shorter pause than she probably intended. "I mean here." I held her gaze. I know that too, I said. She picked up her bag, and then she said, quietly, looking not quite at me, "Don't let Nathaniel do anything irreversible while I'm gone." "I won't," I said. "And Damien?" "Yes." She looked at me then, directly, with the expression that was none of the others, not the evaluating look, not the composed look, not the smile. Something new, something that had been arriving for 8 weeks and was finally here. "Try not to be too alone," she said. She walked through the departure doors. I stood on the pavement for rather longer than was dignified. Then I drove back to Ravencrest. The Regional Wine Awards ceremony was held at Dunhill Valley's main hall on the second Friday of April. It was a society event, the kind of gathering the Valley excelled at, where every table was a careful arrangement of alliances, and where the social temperature of the room was as legible as a weather map to anyone who knew how to read it. 300 people, the same families who had filled St. Callum's Church in October, now reassembled under better lighting with better wine and the same unspoken hierarchy. I arrived early. I chose my seat with care, 3rd row, left side. I did not look for Nathaniel immediately, though I knew he was there. I had confirmed his attendance through channels he wouldn't know about, and I had spent the previous week making sure that what Eleanor needed when she arrived, the documentation, the contacts, the specific evidence in the specific order, was ready. She had done the rest herself. She had spent 7 months in Bordeaux becoming one of the program's most compelling students. She had spent the previous 4 weeks working with her father's team to prepare the Whitmore 2019 vintage for presentation, marketing documentation, technical notes, distribution proposals. She had spent the previous 2 weeks, in correspondence with me, assembling the Blackwood file into something that could be presented publicly, clearly, and without legal exposure. She had become, over 7 months, the person she had been prevented from being for years. I had not seen her since September. I was thinking about that, about all the things we had not yet said, about the question she had asked me before she left, and the fuller answer I still owed her, when the hall doors opened and Eleanor Whitmore walked in. 6 months ago, she had walked into a church in a wedding dress. Tonight she wore a coat the color of dark autumn leaves and carried a folder under her arm and moved through the room with the particular ease of a person who has stopped performing for other people and is simply, finally, being themselves. She saw me. She crossed the room. She sat down beside me in a room full of people who had been talking about her for 6 months, and she said, "Is he here?" "Table 7, I said. "Left of center, with his solicitor and 2 people I don't recognize." She nodded. "And you have everything?" she said. "You have everything," I said. "I sent it Thursday." She nodded again. She opened her folder. She reviewed the first 2 pages with the focused calm of someone preparing to give a presentation, not to detonate a bomb in a room full of people who had decided she was a cautionary tale. Then she closed the folder. She looked at me. "Are you ready?" I asked. "I've been ready since October," she said. She stood up. The Wine Awards ceremony began with a presentation from the Regional Association, followed by a reception, followed by the formal awards. Eleanor was there as a presenter. She had accepted the invitation 6 weeks earlier, which had caused considerable murmuring in the Valley's social networks, all of which I had monitored, and none of which I had engaged with. She presented the first award without incident. Nathaniel Blackwood, at table 7, was very still in a way that I recognized as the composure of someone managing a reaction they don't want to show. Then the Whitmore 2019 vintage won. The applause was genuine, the wine was exceptional, and the people in this room knew it. And Eleanor's father was at table 2 looking like a man who has been given back something he had stopped believing he'd keep. Eleanor went to the podium. She thanked the association. She thanked the estate team. She thanked her father. She spoke for 3 minutes about the 2019 growing season, about the specific conditions that had made the harvest remarkable, about what the estate intended to do with its recognition going forward. Then she paused. The room felt it, the particular quality of a pause that precedes something unexpected. "I also want to speak to something that isn't on the program tonight," she said. "Because there are people in this room who deserve to know the truth about what has been happening in this valley. And I have spent the last 6 months making sure I can say it clearly, accurately, and without anyone being able to tell me I'm wrong." She was looking at the room, not at me. "Nathaniel Blackwood has done this before," she said. Silence. "Twice, in other parts of Scotland. 2 estate families, both targeted through engineered marriages following deliberate financial pressure. I have the documentation. I have the correspondence. I have the prenuptial framework that my own parents signed, without my knowledge, that would have transferred management of the Whitmore estate to a Blackwood-controlled company within 6 months of our wedding." She reached into her folder. "I'm making this information available tonight, to the Highland Register, to the relevant legal bodies, and to the 2 families who may not know that what happened to them was not circumstance." She set the document packet on the podium. She looked up. "I said no at an altar in October," she said. "I said it because someone gave me the information I needed to say it. But I want to be clear tonight about what has happened since then. The Whitmore estate is not in crisis. The 2019 vintage is award-winning. My family did not need saving by a marriage. They needed the truth. And so, I think, does this room." She stepped back from the podium. 300 people did not breathe. At table 7, Nathaniel Blackwood was absolutely still. I was in the 3rd row, left side, and I watched her walk back to her seat with the expression of a woman who has just set something down that she has been carrying for a very long time. She sat beside me. The room began to exhale. Slowly, in sections, like a building settling. She looked at me. "3rd row again," she said. "Habit," I said. She looked at the podium. "I didn't need you to save me that time," she said. "No," I said. "You didn't." A pause. "But I'm glad you were here anyway," she said. I looked at her. And finally, in the room where 6 months ago she had been the subject of a story everyone else was telling, I said what I had been not saying for the better part of a year. "Eleanor." "Yes." "I've been in the 3rd row since October. Every version of that sentence, every version of the room. I would like, at some point, to stop being in the 3rd row." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What row did you have in mind?" I looked at her. "First," I said. The valley buzzed around us. The walls of the old hall held the noise of a town rearranging its opinion in real time. Nathaniel Blackwood was somewhere behind us, at a table that had gone very quiet. None of that, in that moment, was the relevant thing. Eleanor Whitmore looked at me with the expression that was none of the others. Not the composed look, not the evaluating look, not the smile. The new one. The one that had been arriving since October and was finally, fully, here. "1st row," she said. "That sounds right." In Dunhill Valley, people still talk about what happened at St. Callum's Church. They talk about the silence after that one word, about the look on Nathaniel Blackwood's face at the altar and again at the awards ceremony, when everything he had built came apart in public, cleanly and without mercy. They talk less about what came after, about the Whitmore 2019 vintage and the award it won, and the father who watched his daughter rebuild what he had almost lost. About the woman who went to Bordeaux for 7 months and came back knowing exactly who she was. about the man on the cliff who spent 4 years being the most feared name in the valley and turned out to be, quietly, uncomplicatedly, in ways that took time to see, the only person in the story who had told her the truth from the beginning. In October, Eleanor looked at me in a church and found the courage to say no. In April, I found the courage to say something else entirely. We are both still learning what comes after the hard part, but we are learning it in the front row. And that, finally, is exactly where we belong. If this story moved you, if you've ever stopped in the middle of something and found the courage to say the only true thing, share it. Like and follow for more stories like this. I'll see you in the next one.